Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for joining me. Today, I would like to talk about working with deities as framed from my own experience. Because, of course, everyone's experience working with deities is going to be different, especially based on whatever system you're working within. But there are certain guidelines that are fairly universal to follow and will help you at least know that you are traveling in the right direction. So I will be sharing some of my experiences with you, as well as some pointers and tips for making sure that working with a deity is a meaningful growth experience for you. And not a horrible path on which you are led astray. So pretty early on, I developed a real fascination with ancient Egypt. I had seen an episode of Sesame Street where Bert and Ernie talked to a mummy. And it was so fascinating for me and kind of awakened ancient memories deep within my subconscious. One thing that it's important to consider is the cultural context of whatever entity you are choosing to worship, or if they are choosing you. Familiarizing yourself with the overall cultural context, not just of the historical country, but the country as it is now. How ridiculous would it be if we looked at England, for example, purely within the context of Queen Elizabeth, who's on the throne now, and throwing out millennia of history. It's the same with ancient Egypt and ancient religions. You can't ignore the modern culture of that place. And it probably hasn't changed as much as a lot of people would have you believe. These things have stuck around for a reason. The technology that people had at that time was much more advanced than we realize. It's also helpful to have access to DNA testing, because there can be things buried in your DNA that you end up remembering by other means. And without that genetic context, sometimes they don't make very much sense. So it's fortunate that now we do have tools like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Are they doing genetic testing? A lot of these things can be traced back now, which is immensely helpful. But by that same token, if you're being called, you're being called. And I'll get into that more a little bit later as to why you may be called by a deity that is not necessarily an ancestral culture of yours, but it's very likely that somewhere in your ancestry there's a link. So growing up, I had quite a few Egyptian-themed birthday parties. And I was fascinated with goddesses like Bast and Hathor. Aset a little bit, but honestly, we never really synced up. And later I think I realized the reasons for that. But I think in my late teens, early adulthood, before I found out anything about Sekhmet. I was doing a lot of mind expansion research, shall we say, at the time. And started to realize and understand things about myself and my relationship to the world around me that may or may not involve a deity named Sekhmet. And this is where developing discernment becomes very important. I knew that I was being called by this goddess, but I didn't know that much about her yet, and at the time, because this was like the very early days of the internet, remember, I'm actually quite old, it was very difficult to find accurate information about the Egyptian ancient religion and how the rituals were performed and other information like about the calendar. Now it's very easy to find all of that information. I did, when I was 9 or 10, purchase a copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which had the hieroglyphs in it. The Verge version that's got the hieroglyphs, the transliteration, and then the translation underneath. And it was very difficult to wade through that and have that as my primary text. I did also, at some point, pick up a text called the Cannibal Hymn. And for those of you familiar with the pyramid texts, the Cannibal Hymn is part of the pyramid texts and was moved over to the coffin texts in an abridged format, and basically is the spell describing how the deceased, the pharaoh as Osiris, devours the flesh of the gods, and thus gains their power. So one thing that's very important about discernment is doing the research. Even if you don't have very much information available to you, any deity that you are going to work with, if they're reaching out to you, they will make resources available to you to make your task of devotion to them slightly easier. You're not just going to be spoon-fed things, of course, but they'll set you on the right path and help you develop a good relationship with a deity. Should be like a mentor, someone who can help you learn things, someone can help you develop as a person. And if it's not progressing in that direction, you must be very careful. So I did learn a little bit more about ancient Egyptian religious practices, and I did set up an altar to Sekhmet based on communication between us. So this was not a strictly Kemetic Reconstructionist style altar, which would have a naus inside which the neter can reside, regular offerings of food once you have completed the opening of the mouth ceremony for whatever statue you will be using. It's not that this information did not exist at the time that I was doing this, but it was not readily accessible to me, or it did not come to me, and I was looking for it. So my impression was that the relationship that I had with Sekhmet, she would tell me what it was that I needed to be doing. And through gradual opening up to this deity, I was able to discern over time what her intentions were toward me and what it was that I needed to do in return. And it seemed like something that would be very beneficial to me, and of course over the long term it certainly has been. So, as I mentioned, when I set up this altar, it was a devotional altar, but not strictly Kemetic Reconstructionist. And this was the original statue that I purchased for the altar. And as you can see, this statue has a very masculine build and is probably a representation of another lion god named Anhur, who's also a warrior. But at the time that I was buying this statue, if you search for Sekhmet statue, even now, statues like this will come up, even though this is a masculine form. However, I want you to take a close look at the face. Of all of the lion-headed Egyptian statues that I was looking at, this one was far away my favorite. And I discussed this with Sekhmet, and we agreed that for the time being, this would be the statue that I would use. And that was part of my not dedicating it as well, was that I had always been aware that though there's nothing really wrong with this statue, I think you'll agree, it's quite a handsome statue, quite well made, did come from Egypt. And actually there's a precedent of the Queen Hatshepsut being depicted in a very masculine form. But of course, she was quite the iconoclast, so that's not quite the status quo that would have been followed in Egyptian symbolism. Right. But you know, Sekhmet herself can be kind of an iconoclast also. So for the time being, it was acceptable. This was a book that I picked up at some point. I'm not quite sure when, but it's a text by Robert Masters and Jean Houston. And it's all case studies about psychedelic experiences and how they led people to have expansions of their consciousness. Some of it was talking about using hallucinogens to combat hard drug addiction. I haven't read it in a while, but it's very scientific in the way that they handled it. It's not just like I'm going to hang out and watch my friend freak out on drugs. I was very impressed with it when I first read it, and the authors really made a mark on me. Well, maybe a few years later, I end up finding this. Which certainly seemed like a confirmation that I was on the right path. This is another book by Robert Masters, and actually I just realized that the foreword was written by Kenneth Grant, who is, of course, one of the premier scholars on Aleister Crowley. Now, this book does a very good job of framing a lot of the Sekhmet-specific devotional devices, such as her epithets. Does a good job of framing the use of epithets. But it also takes more of a shamanistic approach. So now we have this school of devotion that is moving over into shamanism. Or shamanism, sorry. And we get another book like this, which is Nikki Scully. Now, I'm very glad that I own both of these books, and I'm very glad that I read them both. But they are not the totality of the Sekhmet Heka devotional experience. But they're good stepping stones. With no due respect, I think much better than what most people are introduced to a lot of Wicca practices with, which is Silver Ravenwolf. I'm just going to say that. I'm just going to say that. There is another book. Now, of course, it's very important to go back to the original texts. I've got the Verge Book of the Dead. I also got the Faulkner translation of the Book of the Dead. There's the pyramid texts, which pyramid texts I think are free, available online. I also got the Coffin Texts translation that was from Raymond Faulkner. And the Coffin Text hieroglyphs are available online for free, but unfortunately, I think the translations are only available by buying the books. And there's no transliteration for that, so you have to go back and kind of rework things if you're using transliterations for spells and stuff. And I will be talking much more about the Coffin texts, especially when I start talking about the Bornless Rite. And I'll just let you think about that. This book, which I only purchased recently, but I think it was published in the early 2000s or late 90s, it's by Richard Rady, and it is based on a real temple that was established in San Francisco, a Kemetic Reconstructionist temple. And he goes deep into all of the rituals, the consecrations, keeping a proper temple space, which involves sweeping yourself out of the room. Now, I do back out of my altar space, but I don't necessarily keep it super kosher, I guess is the best way to put it, for lack of better terminology on my part, admittedly. My focus is more toward Heka and less toward the temple life. And you think about the difference between a faith healer, a snake handler, a Catholic, an Episcopalian. That religion flourished for over 3,000 years. There were so many separate, each nome, like each county had their own deity, and then within that they might also be worshiping other major deities. Most of the big cities, like for example Memphis, there was a triad that consisted of Sekhmet, Ptah, the creator god. Well, he was one of the creator gods, and their son Nefertum. So then Isis, Osiris, and Horus being like another big one that you might have heard of. But a lot of the folk practices from Egyptian magic are still being used today. And some people remember the origins and some people don't, and that's fine. I hope that within my rambling, you come to understand that you don't just go out one day and say, I want to worship this deity, and then just blindly follow whatever ends up arriving on your doorstep. If you choose to do that and it works out for you, I think that's great. But especially if you are approaching devotion because of a magical practice, it's very important to maintain discernment and uphold your research. And I learn new things all the time. All the time. I literally just bought this book 2 weeks ago. So it's very important to be open as well. And not to assume that you know everything, or that you know everything about somebody else's practice either. If you couldn't say 1 or 2 sentences to a person that were phrased very politely about how they might want to reconsider their choices, you should probably just keep it to yourself. And that's another part too. As you develop this relationship with a deity, it's, especially in solo practice, it's very easy to forget that other people are having these experiences too. And that it's important to be open to other people's practice, just as much as it's important to be discerning about your own. Which brings me to the next phase of my own devotional development. So anytime I talk to Sekhmet about something regarding the devotional practice or magic, Aset has a lot to do with magic. She is also Weret Hekau. There's Jehuti. There's Seshat, if you want to learn about writing. But whenever I would approach Sekhmet and ask questions about different parts of disciplines, writing, etc., she would say, "Oh, don't worry, I will teach you that myself." It can be a little, I wouldn't say that I was frustrated by that, but it did leave me wondering, well, what's the big deal? Did the author and I not get along? And then it was probably June of 2017. And it was nearing the anniversary of Jack Parsons departing this plane in a blaze of glory, that my friend, who lives up in South Carolina, invited me to be part of a very special ritual that she was putting together in devotion to Babylon. Now, I had never worked with Babylon before, and in fact I had heard some things about working with Babylon. Now, she has a reputation of being a Thelemic goddess, or a Thelemic deity. That's not entirely, she's not entirely tied to Thelema, and I think it's important to make that distinction. One of the very important things about Babylon is that many men will try to claim her, but she belongs to no one but herself. Likewise, there are many goddesses out there that are part of Babylon, but none of them encompass her entirely. One of them, of course, being Inanna. Now, I didn't have a lot of experience with Sumerian deities either, but I did know a bit about them from reading the Necronomicon. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I had studied Sumerian deities a little bit. And I thought about doing, as my part of the ritual, the descent of Inanna into the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, or Ereshkigal. I've heard it both ways. And have that. I felt it tied in really well with the themes of transformation, rebirth, re-energizing that practice. And I was a little conflicted, though, because, of course, it was most important that I discuss with Sekhmet as to whether that was appropriate for me to be doing or not. Now, at the time, I was made to understand that, as a matter of fact, one of the forms of Babylon, of course, is the daughter of fortitude, as visited to Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. And I realized that this energy, Sekhmet, was not entirely Babylon, nor was Babylon entirely any one goddess. But that there was a parity there. And this was something that I was being invited to explore. And so I did. I actually performed that ritual of Inanna's descent into the underworld a few times that summer, because it was very important to me. I was calling something in for sure. And I was successful. That's only one part of the practice, of course. A lot of work with Babylon is sex magic. I do just want to put that out there. And you can read Liber 49, which was the work that Jack Parsons and Marjorie Cameron and none other than L. Ron Hubbard himself were performing back in the 40s. Most of my magical working is rooted in chaos magic, but with a heavy leaning toward a lot of the practices from Heka, So wax figures and wax tablets are used a lot in Heka. Another type of Egyptian folk magic that is mentioned in this book is about knots and knotted magic, binding and unbinding. And I've been doing a lot of research about Egyptian binding magic. There's a lot of scientific papers available now that you can just access on your computer. Can you believe it? So I've been nerding out on that lately as well. But the framework of a lot of the magic that I do is less spell-oriented and more creation-oriented, somewhat performance-oriented as well. A fair amount of my musical performance has been tied into ritual throughout the years. Not all, not exclusively, but somewhat. But by that same token, I have found great success with plucking random spells off of the internet and using them. And this is where your personal context is key. So if you already have all of these correspondences within your framework of the cardinal directions being tied to the 4 elements, for example, a lot of Wicca-based spells are focused around that. You've got candle magic, which is Wicca, root work, hoodoo, folk magic, Appalachian folk magic and hoodoo are like kind of the two halves of the American spiritual magic. And then, of course, you have Native American practices, which kind of form the pages, I guess, is kind of a way of looking at it. But there are ways to also branch out, so you also don't want to feel like I'm working with Odin. I can only use runes. I have to go hang by my heels from a tree. You don't want to be so rigid that you cut yourself off to the outside world. Because the people around you, right? They're not observing the same holidays that you are. They're not performing the same rituals that you are. There are ways of meshing these things together so that they're synchronous rather than totally out of step. And that's important too. One thing about devotion to Sekhmet is that she is a neter of innovation, science, medicine, magic, of course. But I feel like she's been much more open to modernizing certain practices. And of course, that's really, between myself and Sekhmet. If I were to document all these things, it might not have the same effect for you that it does for me. It would be more important for you to cultivate your own relationship with that entity. Whether Sekhmet or someone else. I did also want to mention that when I drove up to South Carolina to perform the ritual, that was back when I was living in Atlanta, typically driving to Columbia would be a 3.5 hour drive tops. And I think on that particular day, it took me 5 hours to get there. It took me a very long time to get there that day. A lot of the roads were shut down and I had to divert. And I was driving on this windy country road through South Carolina. And I could have still been in Georgia at that point. Same difference. Anyway, I felt like I went over something. And I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw like this snake, like lifted up, almost completely vertical like that. It flipped up from the road. And I was like, oh, I'm really heading into something, aren't I? And these are the kinds of signs that you can expect to see when you start working with a particular entity. Now, over time, you'll still see signs, but they will become so integrated into your life that you won't think about it anymore. It'll just kind of be part of your existence. It's also important for me to talk about how some signs, like crows, for example, are particular to more than one deity. So, am I being visited by this crow because of the Morrigan? Am I being visited by this crow because of Hecate? Am I being visited by this crow because it is an ancestor visiting me? Those are all things that it's important to consider and take it on its own. A sign like that might be difficult to decipher. I know that if I see crows, I would be well advised to turn around and leave. I've been warned by crows on more than one occasion. Now, were they sent by anyone? I think, in my case, they were there of their own accord. So, I think that pretty much wraps up for me. Everything that I intended to say in this video about deity devotional practices, right? If you feel comfortable sharing some of your experiences, I would love to hear them down in the comments below. But that's up to you. There's certainly no pressure. Don't feel like you are obliged to share things. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. I hope you had fun. I had fun. And I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.